Hello, everyone. Well, today we are unashamedly focusing on women, taking the theme of this year's International Women's Day to celebrate female achievement and raise awareness about the bias that women sadly still face in society and within the workplace. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by three fantastic guests who are all working hard to break the bias and to change attitudes. Cleo Morris is the founder of Mission Diverse, which aims to tackle bias to ensure equality and opportunity for all in the workplace. Welcome to you, Cleo. Rosa Arias-Yague is a sociologist and anti-bias trainer who helps leaders address gender and racial discrimination. Welcome to you, Rosa. And Joyce Assay is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Consultant here at Frog Systems, who is also addressing issues of bias in the digital content that businesses produce and in the children's books that she writes. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. I think this is going to be a very, very interesting conversation today. And I'd like to sort of kick off really by asking you, each of you, to really say what you think bias is. What exactly is it? Rosa, I know that this is, something that you have been working on in your studies for many, many years. So perhaps we could kick off with you.
Hello everyone. I always like to use a very practical definition because I think it's more logical to do it that way. So it's basically when I meet someone and for the features of the characteristics that I can see for this person or I infer, and usually is skin color, gender, age, kind of, I create in my mind a story about this person, and this story may impact my behaviors towards this person, and this is bias. Creating a story that usually is not related at all with that person that I am meeting, and many times it occurs because this person is from a different group than myself. Is a man, is is someone that I identify as a danger, someone from a different ethnic origin, and is completely come from stereotypes and prejudices from society.
Cleo, would you agree with that and the stereotyping of it?
Yeah, so when I kind of consider bias, it tends to be those assumptions, similar to what Rosa mentioned. It's those preconceived notions that we have about a person or a group of people based on a set of characteristics that we tend to associate. And as a result of that, it changes the way that we interact and act with individuals. And oftentimes when we look at bias or we look at even unconscious bias, it's that intrinsic feeling that you have that you act upon. And again, because it's that internal feeling that people aren't oftentimes aware of, they tend to kind of implicitly act upon it in a negative way. So it's similar to what Rose said, really.
And Joyce, would you agree with that?
Yeah, very similar. So for me, bias is around having an inclination towards someone or against someone, again, linked to stories. So it's either the stories that we're telling ourselves about that particular person or group of people, or the stories that we have been told about that particular person or groups of people. So
and today we're specifically talking about the impact that bias has on women. And Joyce, you've worked, I think, in fairly male-dominated industries before. How has bias against women or towards women, it can work both ways, can't it? How have you seen that impact in the workplace in particular?
Yeah, well, I remember working in the publishing industry, and I had a colleague that was in one of the other teams, and she actually used to come into work early and finish at 4:30 so that she was able to, take care of the children or go on for childcare. But interestingly, that was kind of perceived as her having a half day. And yeah, or, being called a part-timer, which wasn't fair at all, but that was the kind of culture in that particular industry. And I've experienced it as well, where after taking a year out for maternity leave, I came back into the workplace, and my child was going to be turning 1 within a couple of weeks, the first 2 weeks that I was back, and I just didn't feel that I could actually ask for that time off because I'd been away for so long. And that left me feeling really guilty. But yeah, I clearly didn't feel that I was in an environment where me asking for that time off would be seen as something valued and not diminished. So I didn't say anything, and I didn't take that day off.
That's very sad to hear. Rosa, you must hear a lot of this in the work that you do.
Yes, no, definitely. And for me, it's always surprising, not that people bring about how women still are more interrupted at work or in meetings. They present an idea, and then it's someone else, the one who reframed that idea, and is recognized when it's presented by a male colleague. So to me, it's still shocking that in 2022 this keeps happening, but we need to be aware that this keeps happening and we need to break it. So if there is a study done by United Nations Development Program that at a very global level, so I think it's 75 countries, over 80% of the population, and it says that 90% of the population hold a gender bias towards women. So we really need to do something about it.
And Cleo, you've sadly had very sort of significant experience of this. You know, I know you did a piece with Birmingham Live, didn't you, about an experience that you had not so long ago. As well as running Mission Diverse, you also run a catering company as well called My Dine. Just relay the experience that you had to everybody.
Yeah, sure. So I was actually heading into my office around about 6 o'clock in the evening, and a gentleman who needed to get his client out of the car park, which has barriers, wasn't able to do so. So he asked me to let his client out of the car park, but with it being late at night, you know, in the winter months, I asked, you know, have security got clearance, X, Y, and Z? And in response to me asking that question, kind of who I'm letting in and then out the car park for security reasons, he met me with the response of, well, I'm sure you're one of the cleaners, so you can just open the barriers. And for me, that's kind of where we look at bias, and actually, are we looking at bias or are we just looking at racial microaggressions? And oftentimes the two things can get confused. For me, I took that as a very obvious and clear racial microaggression based on a bias that he had towards people, one, who were people of colour, and two, women. And again, those two things really do intersect in the way that someone's language is or their behaviour is towards me or someone who looks like me, for example.
And how prevalent do you think this bias, particularly against the female, is in the workplace today? I know Rosa said, you know, it's such a shame that we still have to talk about this in 2022, but is it still very prevalent within the workplace as well?
Yeah, I think so, because I think people tend to look at bias and gender and even gender discrimination, and they tend to think of it as something as kind of that was happening 20, 30 years ago and women couldn't work. And actually, it just manifests itself in a different way today. So, for example, you find far more indirect kind of language towards individuals, like microaggressions I mentioned there, but it's not as overt. So it still does happen in this day and age, very much so. It's just presented in a different way, which we kind of need to be aware of, which is why we have discussions like this, really.
One of the things that I was looking at when I was researching what we might talk about today, obviously it's a big subject, but one of the things that struck me is that, you know, a lot of the workplace policies are, you know, are managed and set by HR, people in HR, and yet a lot of HR people are women. And I just kind of, it just made me sort of struck me as an odd thing. You know, do we need to educate the women who are helping to run policy and set policy in the workplace as well as the men? I don't know. Joyce, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I think we all need to take individual responsibility in this, in terms of bias. So absolutely, it's a two-way conversation. It's not an issue that's only for women, that we have to, you know, try and break the bias in that sense. Men are also part of the conversation as well. So absolutely, it's for both genders or all genders to be part of the change that we want to see.
Rosa, do you just talk about the work that you do then when you go into a company or an organization? Where do you start when you're trying to tackle the bias?
I think the first step is awareness, is getting into a process of getting to know ourselves, because as Joyce was saying, it's all of us. We all have biases, and we are increasingly aware of that now. So, but at a personal level, is understanding where those biases are in each of us, because I know I have certain biases that come from my Spanish background and really impact me in ways that probably will not impact you or other people here. And if you want a tool, go to the implicit association test by the University of Harvard. If you Google, you are going to get it. And there, it is not a perfect tool, but to me, it's the best tool we have to measure our unconscious or implicit biases. And from there, we can start working, right? So we can start. I took 3 tests, and in one of them, I was highly biased. It was much easier for me to do the other ones that I was not biased and say, oh, that is such a great tool. When I took the 3rd one and I got that, it was like, oh my God, how is this possible? And the result was I was highly biased against people with overweight. All right, I come from a country where everyone is telling you need to lose weight. I have had an eating disorder myself. So there are many things, but I was not aware of it. But as I always say, this is the first step. And then we need to engage in a process of slowing down, tuning the present moment, and break the bias when it comes, because it's going to come. But we need to understand, okay, this is a stereotype, this is a prejudice, and break it at that point. And I develop a framework to support my clients to do so. So I'm happy to continue the conversation. But I think awareness, we need to be clear on that, is just the first step. We need to keep engaging in more empathetic conversations. We need to keep moving.
And as Kieran has pointed out a question here, do you believe that bias can be so prevalent that you actually start to live up to it? And what can we do to stay away from living up to stereotypes?
So I think, and Joyce and Cleo, maybe you want to reply to this one?
Yeah, so I tend to think when we look at kind of biases, I don't think it's about living up to stereotypes. So when we do a lot of training with organizations and leadership teams, we look at things like code switching, which is a person's need to behave differently around different people to fit in. And it kind of ties in with this notion of respectability politics, which people aren't really that familiar with. And it's this idea that a person has to behave a different way to how they would normally behave to prevent discrimination. And actually, I always say, and when we do any kind of work with any organization, that you need to allow people to be their authentic self. And stereotypes tend to be pre-subscribed notions from other groups of people. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's innate to that individual. So, for example, I'm a Black female. People tend to assume that we're loud, angry, and brash, and that's the stereotype that is kind of carried through. When actually, when people speak to me, they go, "Oh, well, you're very well spoken and very well educated," but that's only based on that preconceived notion of stereotype. I wouldn't behave any differently because they have that idea. I think we need to kind of move away from this idea of respectability politics, where people assume that they must behave in a certain way to refrain from a stereotype that shouldn't be attributed to them anyway. And that's what I kind of look at when we talk about moving away from stereotypes, is actually we need to address the stereotype, not the behavior that people make synonymous with that individual or group of people.
Joyce?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. My children pointed out the fact that I sound different depending on the people I'm speaking with. So I didn't even realize that that was a thing. And then I became aware of it and did some research around it and found out that that was code switching. So they said that I sounded different that when I do the school run compared to when I'm at work. I thought that was very interesting. But yeah, certainly I think, around the stereotypes and the biases, I very much try to disrupt those narratives that we might have with us when we're looking to create content and people are sharing their lived experiences. It's really important to get perspectives from people from all different backgrounds, so that you're getting that. You're getting a view through a different perspective, through a different lens. So I really try and disrupt that. So if there's this stereotype of Black women being angry of course, not all Black women are angry. And I would actually say that the word angry, it probably comes from frustration with all the things that, a Black woman has to go through in the workplace and in society. So I'd probably say it's a frustrated Black woman, not an angry one. But yeah, certainly for me, we have to disrupt those narratives and the stereotypes by showing people the different perspectives that they have on particular issues that they experience in society.
And some of this, I guess, in the workplace, it's it's maybe not just bias against women, but there's always, well, very often there's a loudest speaker in the room, isn't there? And everybody else is quiet, and that person then gets their point of view over. And the only reason they've got that point of view over is because they happen to be the loudest. And maybe somebody who's a bit shy, a bit reticent to sort of put their foot forward doesn't. And actually, they might well have the best idea in the room, but they aren't able to share it. How do we sort of overcome that as well? There's a lot to do here. Cleo.
Well, yeah, sure. So we look at this thing called echoing, and basically it was something that was created in the US in the White House, and the actual purpose of it was around allowing women to be heard in those kind of positions where actually they might have great ideas, but they're actually not listened to, or it's repeated by somebody else, and oftentimes a male colleague, and the credit's attributed to them. So we work with organisations around echoing and actually how to implement that effectively within organisations to, one, ensure that everyone's heard, but two, to create some kind of credibility and feeling of belonging. So, if you're, for example, a female or a person who identifies as gender non-conforming, for example, how do we communicate a message if you're not the most outspoken person or you're not the loudest in the room? And actually it's repeating that same message, but attributing the credit to the individual who came up with that idea originally. And actually working with organisations to develop that kind of echoing process actually really does go a long way to engaging people from all walks of life, regardless of age, gender, race, the whole kind of spectrum of characteristics.
And are we doing? How is the way that you can do that then? So in a boardroom or in senior management, for instance, which is obviously where a lot of these biases crop up. Is it more about making the culture of the business more collaborative? Without necessarily focusing on the male-female divide that there might be in the business?
Yeah, exactly that. So I think oftentimes we can be too quite granular in terms of like male and female splits, when actually it's just about acknowledging that person. So we oftentimes say, make it about yourself when you echo an individual. So say, I really like that idea from this person, for example. I think we should really consider what they've come up with. So for example, I might say, I really like what Rosa just said about X, Y, and Z. And the idea is to reinforce what she said and actually to also attribute credit to what she said too. And that can be done regardless of, like I say, gender, race, age, ethnicity. And it just allows people to, one, be acknowledged and accredited for the ideas that they have without having to speak or shout the loudest in the room.
Rosa, you would agree with that?
No, absolutely. And I love the example that Cleo has chosen, because we have to remember that this was started, the example that she brought about is the Obama administration, that was a feminist administration. And women there realized that they were not being heard and they needed to do something about it. And what they did was amplifying each other. So probably what we need to do is changing the narrative. Sometimes we tend to continue with the male idea of confidence, of the male idea of leadership. Well, leadership can be many things, and we need to build something different, something more collaborative, something where different views from different people, binary, non-binary, female, all of us are included, because this is going to be much better for the organizations.
Joyce, is that an easy thing for organizations to do, though, especially in an organization, for instance, say, I don't know, but pick the tech industry, which is notoriously, very male and quite hard to, for women. We've seen lots of, protests and all the rest of it about the way that women are treated in some of the big tech companies at times. How easy is it to actually change a culture? Is it a matter of we have to get more women into senior leadership roles to do that, and that's a problem because that is taking a long time to do, or are there other ways that we can do this, do you think?
Well, I think culture change is a very difficult thing. Let's be honest. Nobody wants to. We talk about wanting change, but when we need to make it happen, nobody or very few people want to put in the work. So it does boil down to the leader, and the leader needs to be showing what his values are. Because when the leader demonstrates that he believes in gender diversity, he believes has a value around diversity across all the spectrums, and people can see that modeled in the teams that they're working in the environments that they're working in, then people will act in alignment with that. So it does boil down to the senior leadership ultimately, for them to see the value in diversity and the impact that has on the business and also on their clients and the customers and the supply chain, that whole virtuous circle.
And then there's the issue of actually bringing women into an organisation, isn't there? And I noticed that there's been use of technology to try and take gender, and certain words out of recruitment adverts and all the rest of it. And actually, some of that has backfired because AI looks at what's gone before, and what's gone before is a recruitment process that was based a lot around what men put in their CVs. So Cleo, is there anything happening in that space that is working now in terms of the recruitment specialists putting out adverts, companies putting out adverts that are allowing women to get a step in, a foot in the door, that they're not sort of ruled out before they've even applied for the job, kind of thing?
Yeah, I think there's a mixture of different types of activities that are going on. So we work quite closely with organisations on their recruitment processes, and even down to things like diversifying the recruitment board of people. So especially in larger organisations, we find that they outsource it. So although they might be doing a lot of work internally around what they think is equitable change, actually when they source out that piece of kind of recruitment, they don't actually understand what the organisation's looking at. So oftentimes we found that we work collaboratively with recruitment companies and the organisations that are doing the hiring, because the two need to kind of sing from the same hymn sheet in order to kind of enable people to progress in that space. And you talk about the changes that have been made through hiring, such as CV monitoring and evaluation, but also again, like I say, in terms of the diversification of the recruitment process and how people look at putting out adverts, because oftentimes we think, oh, we're not attracting these type of people, and we hear this kind of language, are hard to reach, or when actually they're just not really they're not really looked for. And as a result of that, it tends to detract from the potential you can bring into an organisation. And I think a lot more work's now been done in terms of looking at different areas and pockets of people and where they are actually based to engage them from a far wider space of people.
And Rosa, I don't know if you've got a thought on how do you make a job advert encourage more women to apply for a job? I genuinely don't know the answer to this. Are there words that you don't use? Because I mean, even if you take the gender out of a CV application process, you're going to see hobbies or things that you've done during your career or at school that must show that you're female. So how do you kind of level that up? I genuinely don't know the answer to that.
Okay, I think safe recruitment is helping. So just putting a set of policies to make sure that we keep our biases apart. And there are two things here. In the ad, what you are saying is true. So we can write down an ad that is attracting more female or more male, because there are certain words that are very subtly coded. Okay, so and there is a tool that I recommend that is like a gender decoder, but obviously you have to take it. It's just a tool. So this is not 100% perfect. But yes, with the ad, you can attract more people that are female or male, and you have to keep an eye on that. Regarding the information that you see from the applicants, well, maybe you can just make sure that you block certain information that is personal if you are using blind CVs or blind applications, for instance. So this can be done in order to to break those biases. And I think just to get more women, and we are talking here women with a very inclusive way, binary and non-binary people who identify with as women. So if you get more, sometimes women are not hired because they don't get into the selection processes. So it's also to check all the things that Cleo has mentioned and check where your ads are going, which channels are you using? Are you reaching diverse people or only male and white because you are choosing certain channels? So there are still things that I think they are increasingly done by different companies and organizations.
And Joyce, I mean, I know you go out and you work in schools, don't you? And you read the books that you've written, which are very much about, encouraging young people, particularly from ethnic minority as well, to think differently about their future, and for young girls to not be constrained by, what their future might look like. How, I guess it's important, isn't it, that this education piece starts when they're young, not just when they're looking, to get their first job or starting out on a career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I created the children's book that I did, because I observed that there was something missing, and that was around the representation of African Caribbean characters in children's books. And having worked in the D&I space for quite a significant amount of time, and trying to work with adults to shift the dial, sometimes it can feel like you're hitting a brick wall. So another way of approaching it is actually with the next generation, and being able to spark that curiosity for them to want to find out about people from different cultures and different countries. And yeah, by reading that book and just sharing that story with children, I've read it to, I think, nearly about 1,000 children in the Essex region, and all of them want to go to Barbados, which is where the book is set, and experience that culture and try the different foods. And that's something that, if it's not brought into their consciousness, they wouldn't have any idea to want to try that. So I think we do need to start conversations early, and that's around reading diverse books to our children so that they know that things are possible. Women can be engineers, women can go to space and everything else. So it all starts really early, but we need to read those books to our children.
Yeah. One of the difficulties is encouraging young women then to apply for those careers or study that at college or university. Why do we think that there is still, there's still not so many young girls applying for some of what you call the male-dominated industries? Have you come across that, Joyce, in the work that you do? And, is there any way that we can kind of try and change the dial on that?
Yeah, I mean, what has come out from that is around the role modeling or lack of role models. And it does boil down to, who are you seeing in those particular roles? So if visually you're not seeing females being represented, you don't think that that's possible. And so that's why it's really important as well, for women to put themselves forward. So I know there's an element where some women kind of self-select or not, opt out of opportunities, but it's just so important, because the more people see you in these particular roles, that inspires them, and then they know it's possible, especially in regulated industries.
Yeah. So Joyce, you're talking about how those role models can inspire, and then Rosa, I'm thinking, when they then get to a career where they've maybe taken that step and they've gone into what you'd call a traditional kind of male-dominated industry or sector. But then if a lot of women obviously decide to have children, have to take a pause in their career, and making those careers a bit more flexible, making the hours, something that you could change, depending on what your situation is. That all has to be factored in, doesn't it? When you actually get to the point where you've got the young girls coming through to these careers, how do we then get them to stay in those careers, even if they want to take some time out, maybe to have a family or, you know, whatever it is?
I think that we have to change the narrative, and we have to understand that having children is something that both men, male and female, do. So engaging, so there has to be paternity leave where the woman goes and then the father goes. And we need to increasingly accept that. I was reading the other day that in Spain, one man was fired because he wanted to take the paternity leave. That now is equal in Spain for both female and male. So I think that is important, because if we change that narrative, it will be increasingly easier for women. Also understanding that research shows that flexible work is very important, but not only for female, also for male that maybe need to take care of someone at home. So flexible work is important, and we need to try to do that. But on the top of that, I think it is key to work with young generations and making them see the books are really important, to see different people, but also making them believe that they can do it. And with young professionals, I think it is also important to create networks. Networks where they feel that they are learning and they feel supported. And if you are a young female professional, there is a course that I would recommend, and it's not related to me at all. So I have no interest, but it's upfront. Is doing a course on confidence for female, very diverse network. And I think it is very important that we feel that we can support each other and that we can cheer up and that we can do it. I really think it's important.
And Cleo, that makes me think of mentorship, isn't it? You know, having a mentor that within an organization that can help you, you know, and that you can go to without having to, you know, make an issue of something with HR, for instance, all the time. Is that something that's quite important in this?
Yeah, I think mentoring's it plays a part. I wouldn't say it's kind of I wouldn't say it's a substitute for, say, for example, if there is an issue within an organisation to not go to HR. But I think some kind of mentorship and reverse mentoring, where effectively the mentee is teaching the mentor and vice versa, is as crucially important, because within an organisation, whether you sit in the C-suite at the board position or whether you're kind of a junior staff member, you can learn what the processes are and what people feel within different spaces, things that others don't consider. For example, if you're sitting at, you know, in the C-suite level of an organisation, you're looking at the operational side and how the organisation functions. Whereas if you're, say, a junior member of staff, you're looking at it from how you have to operate within that space. And that space might not be, one, inclusive, and two, it might present so many different challenges that it's pretty difficult to work within, which somebody who's sitting at that, you know, that level within the C-suite might not even have considered previously. And actually having that reverse level of mentoring is as crucial to, you know, the traditional kind of a more senior individual working with a person who's considered more junior, because you can both learn about ways to create an environment that's more accessible for everybody to operate within.
Excellent. So we're nearly coming to the end of our chat, and it's been absolutely fascinating. So I wonder whether we can sort of reflect on where we are now and what the goal is, you know, to try and make sure that we're not having this conversation this time next year. You know, Joyce, what's, you know, are you optimistic about the way that things are moving in both in general society and the workplace? Do you think change is happening, and you know, are we going to get to a point where hopefully we won't have to, you know, address this anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd love to get to that point, won't we, where we don't have to be having these conversations. But the reality of it is that we will be, unfortunately. But the good news is that there are thousands of people around the world that are working on this whole kind of diversity and inclusion puzzle. And we're all doing our little bits across the globe to try and shift that dial. And so, yeah, it boils down, again, I would say, a combination of individuals taking responsibility, so that we are catching ourselves and we're acknowledging that we all have biases. So it's, if you're not even acknowledging that, then there is an issue there. So to acknowledge that we all have biases and to catch ourselves so that we're aware and we're present to when we're having those thoughts, and, you know, why do we think about someone in a particular way, and what would be the opposite actually if we thought that. So we can do that on an individual basis, but and also on an organizational basis. Things around, you know, gender pay gap and also promotions, to just be more transparent with those processes so that women know what they need to work towards and can navigate that. So those are the two tips that I would share.
So transparency there, Rosa. What would your thoughts be on where we're headed and how we can get to grips with all this?
I completely agree with Joyce. It's hard for me to imagine a world with no discrimination right now, but I want to believe that it's possible. And I think in order to do that, from this session, it will be good if we get with an idea that we would like to do something, whatever, small thing, right? To be more inclusive, or explore and from there. So, can I become a governor at the local school to engage in action and reflect what can we do and go for it?
And Cleo, you're the youngest amongst us, so we'll leave the last word to you. Are you optimistic for where this is all headed?
Yeah, I am. I mean, people say I'm an old head, so yeah. But yeah, I tend to think, like, they're saying I live by quite openly when it comes to things like this, is progress is a slow process. So although we kind of had these conversations, as long as there's some action afterwards, I think it's great to have these conversations. So in 12 months, if we're still having them, it's great, but we need to talk about what's changed in the last 12 months, as opposed to, we had this conversation, you know, in March of this year. Next year we have the same conversations, because that's when we lose any kind of momentum. So I always tend to think people need to look at it as a long-term goal as opposed to a short-term fix. And my second piece would be allow people to be their authentic self. I think oftentimes we have this perception of how people should present or behave or look, and the biases that people tend to have. I mean, for example, today I come in my hoodie because this is how I come to work and it's how I operate, it's how I do things. Doesn't make me any less professional than anybody else wearing a, you know, £500 suit, for example. And it's allowing somebody to be comfortable in how they feel and how they operate within the workspace and outside of it too, because it will encourage them to want to be, you know, in an environment with you or the colleagues and in the wider space too. So allow people to be their authentic self and understand that, you know, progress is a very slow process. As long as you're on that journey, that's the way to go.
Well, all three of you are doing fantastic work in this space, so really appreciate you spending the time with us today. And I don't think we've got any more questions at the moment, so hopefully that means that we've actually covered a lot of the things that people had tuned in to hear from us. So thank you, all of you, for joining us, Cleo, Joyce and Rosa. Just a quick reminder about Frog Systems. You know, we provide wellbeing and inclusion platforms. I know some of you on this discussion listening in today will have a platform for us, so we'll put lots of information related to the conversation that we've had on there a little later on, and obviously some links to some interesting information, podcasts, other articles that will help you along the way to help break the bias. You can follow us on social media, and as I say, we'll put the recording onto our YouTube channel as soon as possible. We'll send that out to everybody as well. And don't forget, we've got plenty more live streams coming down the line. Our next one is all about how to help you manage money and budget better, something that's quite important in the world that we're living in at the moment. So please do join us on the 24th of March at midday for that if you can. With the links are all on our social media at the moment. But for the moment, thank you so much, Cleo, Rosa and Joyce, and have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.